A special parliamentary committee has recommended that Canada not proceed with expanding medical assistance in dying, or MAID, to people whose sole underlying condition is a mental illness. The committee's report was released yesterday, and it comes after years of debate and testimony from clinicians, disability advocates, legal experts, and people with lived experience. The report is not binding on the government, but it could play an important role in shaping the national conversation on medical assistance in dying in Canada. Krista Carr is the CEO of Inclusion Canada, an organization that advocates for the rights and inclusion of people with intellectual disabilities and their families. Krista Carr, thanks very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So as I was mentioning, this debate has been unfolding for years, and yesterday's report was obviously a significant and major development. I know that your organization has welcomed the committee's recommendation. What was your reaction when you first learned of it?
I was really pleased that the committee did make the recommendation to put an indefinite pause on MAID for mental illness, so really happy to hear that. And if the government accepts the recommendation, then they will have to introduce legislation to repeal the sunset clause altogether from the legislation. So certainly preferable to just another 2-year delay or another 3-year delay, that sort of what we've seen in the past.
And what's your understanding of the reasons that are behind the committee's recommendation? Because obviously one of the key concerns throughout this debate has been the extent to which we know whether clinicians can say reliably whether mental illness is truly irremediable. How important do you think that issue played into the committee's recommendation?
I think there were a number of things that played into the committee's recommendation. The fact that it's very difficult, if not impossible, to determine when someone's mental illness is irremediable. The lack of any kind of consensus within the psychiatric community about whether this was something that should be gone forward with or not. I think another thing that really played into it was also just the lack of access to mental health services, supports, clinicians, across the country, and particularly depending on where you live, and mental health treatment can be expensive if you don't have dollars. All of those kinds of pieces, I think, were all part and parcel of the reason why they landed where they did.
Mm-hmm. And so what is it that concerns you most about because obviously you've laid out several of those different concerns, but what concerns you most about this idea, this prospect of expanding MAID to people whose sole underlying condition is mental illness? Why is it so concerning?
Well, we've maintained for a long time in the disability community, it's certainly not just Inclusion Canada, that Track 2 MAID, which is mental illness, would be an expansion of Track 2, which is for persons with disabilities not at end of life, so we're not talking about dying people. Most people never make that distinction, is discriminatory because it singles out one particular group of people as having access to death by lethal injection as a means of resolving their suffering, when we know that the suffering of persons with disabilities is very much often caused by the social, the poverty, the lack of inadequate housing, the lack of disability support, social isolation, all of kind of those pieces. The other big thing would be mental illness. A lot of people also didn't understand, or I don't think still understand, that the expansion of MAID to mental illness would have meant not just what you would typically think of when you think of mental illness, but they'd be using the definition of mental disorder in the DSM-5, which means 297 different types of conditions, which include everything from eating disorders, trauma, intellectual disability, autism. The list is quite expansive. Mm-hmm. Most people really didn't even have a good handle on that.
Yeah, but for people who did want to see MAID expanded to those whose underlying condition is mental illness, they point to people who've been living with severe trauma-resistant mental illness, people who've been suffering from this for years, if not decades, people suffering despite repeated interventions. So, what do you say to Canadians who feel that this recommendation leaves them without an option, potentially, that they feel they should have access to?
Well, I think there's a couple of things around that. One is, certainly we're not going to negate anyone's suffering in any way, shape, manner, or form. However, we have to think about, when I listened to the testimony that came before the committee, there were a number of clinicians that talked about the fact that sometimes people take a longer time to get better, and there's all kinds of new treatments emerging all the time, and people, when they're working with people, it can often take a while to figure that out. So I think that the fact that trying to distinguish whether someone can or cannot get better is a very difficult process. And I think in relation to that, if you open this up to MAID for people with mental illness, you're opening it up broadly, right? So how you even distinguish who can get better, who can't get better, how many people is it okay to lose in that process by making the wrong distinction. And I think from the mental health perspective, we've advocated for years that recovery is possible, that we need to do everything we possibly can to save the lives of people with mental illness and treat the mental illness and make people better. And bringing in MAID as the option for addressing the suffering of people with mental illness is extremely dangerous.
Now, you mentioned Track 2, and your organization is calling on Parliament to also revisit Track 2 to reconsider it. And for viewers who may not be familiar, Track 2, it applies to eligible adults who, as you said, their natural death is not reasonably foreseeable, but they still meet the eligibility criteria. And as I understand it, they must undergo like a more rigorous assessment before they can actually access MAID. But why is it that you feel that Parliament should revisit Track 2 in its entirety?
So first of all, Track 2 really singles out persons with disabilities. So it's irremediable medical condition, disease or disability, but they're all disabling conditions. At the end of the day, it all wraps up into people who have a disability, right? Who are supposed to be protected under our charter. And it becomes, first of all, we believe, and we've filed a court case to this effect, that it discriminates under Section 7 and 15 of the Charter against people with disabilities because they're the only group singled out for death by lethal injection when they're not otherwise dying. And besides the discriminatory nature of that, why is that so concerning? Well, we know that people with disabilities have disproportionate rates of poverty and lack of supports, inadequate housing, and all the things I mentioned earlier in this conversation. And we get calls at our organization from across the country regularly on this issue. And we track them and we log them. And it is really stunning the number of people who call who have either applied for MAID and been approved, but do not want to have to go through with it. And they're looking for somebody, anyone who can help so that they don't have to go down that road. Or people who are contemplating MAID. And in every situation, in every single instance, it's individuals who are struggling with poverty, with lack of supports, with young man who has muscular dystrophy, who's living at home with his mother, who's providing a certain amount of in-home supports. She gets cancer and dies, and now they want to institutionalize him and put him in a nursing home at 30 years old to get the support that he needs. So these are not, and then we call it autonomous choice. So we kind of say, well, this is an autonomous choice of people. It's not an autonomous choice. It's the people that call our office are certainly not in a position of making autonomous choices. They're making impossible choices because the supports and services they need to live a life with dignity are not available to them.
So, I mean, your organization is outlining all these fundamental questions it's raising, right, about safety, vulnerability, equality, how we treat and support people who are experiencing suffering. And I think people appreciate those concerns, especially when they hear the kinds of stories that you're sharing with us now. It's just awful situations. I think they understand all that, they appreciate all of that. They also weigh that against also, personal autonomy. And in some cases, not all, certainly not the ones that you're raising, but in some cases, people who, have made their decision that this is the option that they would prefer. How do you balance that then? And is there any room for more gray in between those two positions and recognizing that in some cases, someone is in a position to make that decision and they're probably best placed to make it?
So there's a couple of things on the autonomy piece, right? So first of all, it's so interesting to me that I want to go back to the discrimination piece. We're only interested in giving this autonomous right to one particular group of people. We don't give it, I mean, suffering is part of the human condition. We all experience it at varying times in our lives. We're all in periods of despair at varying times in our lives. But we don't offer MAID broadly across the board to people who are suffering, right? We've singled out one group. And then we've talked about giving them autonomy, and only them. And what I would say about the autonomy argument is the state puts limits on personal autonomy when there is a risk of a greater harm to a larger group of people, right? So we had COVID restrictions, right? We had quarantine restrictions. We have drunk driving laws. We are not allowed to run around Walmart and carry a gun. There are all kinds of limits that get put on personal autonomy. Like, we don't exercise it at any, because the risk of harm to a greater group of people is the fundamental decision point. So I guess that would be certainly a factor we need to really be thinking about here.
Obviously, so the committee has made its recommendation. Ultimately, the decision will rest with the government. We did hear from Justice Minister Sean Fraser yesterday, who said he'll take the time necessary to fully consider the report and all the testimony that was behind it. What would you like to see them do next? What do you expect?
I would like to see them, I mean, they're rising this week, so we're not going to get legislation right away. I'd like to see them introduce legislation very promptly when they come back in September that would permanently repeal the sunset clause out of the legislation. And ultimately, so that on the committee's decision, that's what I would like to see. Ultimately, we would like to see them repeal Track 2 altogether. And many of the arguments against Track 2 are the same arguments against MAID for mental illness. So we would like them to take a broader look at Track 2 altogether. But in terms of the committee's report, we would like to see them act on the recommendation and do it swiftly.
And I'll just close on this, and you've already alluded to this already, but how should we be thinking about this debate and what it tells us about how Canada supports people living with disabilities and mental illness more broadly? What does this debate tell us about what they're experiencing?
I think it tells us a lot about the fact that it sends a few messages. So Track 2 MAID in general sends a message to people with disabilities that there are certain lives we feel are worth saving and certain ones that we're going to offer other alternatives for. And I think that's really sad. But I think at the end of the day, what we really need to be thinking about in terms of this debate is what's the kind of society. What it says to us is we live in a society where people lack the supports they need to live with dignity. We're very focused on making sure a certain group of people can die with dignity, who are not already dying, not talking about the people who are. But we're not at all focused on making sure people have lives of dignity. And offering MAID to people who are not dying is not going to make our service and support systems better, because what will be the impetus to invest in those service systems and making supports better and income supports better and disability-related supports better when there's this special pathway? If it really gets too bad, we have this. And this option saves us a lot of money across the board. And at the end of the day, there are studies already being run on how much Track 2 MAID has saved the government of Canada, even Track 1 for that matter, the governments across Canada, I should say. And I think that's a really dangerous thing. We have to be thinking about what's the society we want, and is it one that values everyone's lives and does the best it can to make those as good and robust as it can, or is it not?
Well, that's certainly a lot to think about, so we'll continue to watch the debate as it continues to unfold. Krista Carr, CEO of Inclusion Canada, thanks again for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.